When you meet with a deaf or hard of hearing student in your office, you may feel that the two of you don't need interpreter services because the two of you are communicating just fine. The student understands you, and you're understanding the student. So you're puzzled when the student asks for interpreter services for their class. You don't understand because the two of you have been communicating just fine without interpreter services. Deaf and hard of hearing students vary in their communication approaches. All communication involves both the ability to comprehend and the ability to express oneself. Deaf and hard of hearing students' hearing losses will vary as well. The degree of loss, the type of loss, the age of onset, and also their preferred communication approach. Communication will also vary based on the setting, whether it be a classroom, a one-on-one conversation, or even in a social conversation with their friends. The purpose of the conversation will also vary. One possible communication approach is to use speech reading. Students who have some residual hearing may be able to capitalize on that residual hearing while they're speech reading. Speech reading may be effective in some situations and not effective in others. I just mentioned a number of variables: the degree of loss, the type of loss, and preferred communication mode. These will influence the student's ability to proficiently speech read. It's important to also recognize that speech sounds on the mouth can only be seen 30% of the time. That means 70% of the speech sounds cannot be seen. In order to effectively speech read, the student needs to rely on any residual hearing that they have and their ability to assess the body language of the person who is speaking as well as their facial expressions in order to comprehend the conversation. Speech reading tends to be more effective in one-on-one circumstances. When the student is in a class, and particularly during class discussions, that's more difficult to follow. And the reason is that there may be multiple speakers at the same time, and it's very difficult to follow just one conversation. The instructor also may turn their back to the classroom while speaking, and the student, of course, will then miss what the teacher is saying. Acoustics come into play as well. There may be an echo or other extraneous noises like a fan that will interfere with their abilities. It may be hard to speech read at those times. Room size, the speaker may be far from the student, or even the lighting. The lighting may be dimmed and it may be too dark. There may be external light coming through a window, creating shadows on the speaker as well. The student also needs to be familiar with the terminology in the topic at hand. They also need to consider the fact that the classroom interaction patterns may vary. The teacher may be giving a lecture clear throughout the class time, or the teacher may establish discussion groups where there are many conversations overlapping, making it difficult to follow when there's more than one speaker speaking at the same time. Other instructor variables include whether or not the instructor has an accent, whether they have facial hair, which will perhaps mask the speaker's lips. All of these various factors will determine if the student needs a sign language interpreter for their class. Perhaps the class is small, the lighting is ideal, and the instructor has no facial hair. The student can clearly speech read. That would be an ideal circumstance. But other classroom situations create so many other variables, as I've already discussed, that make it important for other accommodations. I've been discussing about the student's ability to comprehend speech, but now let's discuss how the student expresses for themselves. It really depends on the situation. If it's a one-on-one interaction and they're sitting in your office, for example, the student may speak apparently very clear, their volume is sufficient, and the student's speech seems intelligible. You understand one another. In a classroom, however, the student may not be able to modulate their speech. They may not be speaking loudly enough, or their speech might not be intelligible for all the members of the class. In a one-on-one circumstance versus a classroom, their accommodation needs will be different. You also need to consider the fact that the student may not be comfortable speaking. They may be aware that their speech may not always be clear. And in those instances, you should bring in an interpreter who is able to express in spoken English what the student is signing. That gives the student full access for participating in the classroom. It also means that when you meet with the student is familiar with the content at hand. In the classroom, however, information may be new. The student may not be familiar with the vocabulary and the topic that's being presented. These are instances where an interpreter needs to be provided, or some other services in order to provide them access to full communication. Now, the person who can best determine their needs is the student themselves. Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, states specifically that colleges and universities must give primary consideration to the students' communication preferences. For additional resources and links, please see the bottom of our printed frequently asked questions on our website.